The night Tayan was cast out, there were no words spoken, no ceremony. No one raised their hand to strike her, no one shouted or cursed. That would have been easier to bear. Instead, there was silence, an unbearable silence that told her more than any words could have. She was no longer wanted. She was barren, a burden, a shadow taking up space where food was scarce and futures were counted in children. And so, without a word, her people turned their faces away. She walked east because west meant looking back, and there was nothing left behind her but rejection. The desert swallowed her footsteps quickly, sand erasing any proof she had ever belonged to anyone. Each step burned, each breath scraped, and yet she kept moving. She had nothing, no water, no food, no weapon. But the earth itself seemed to dare her to lie down and let it take her. Still, she walked. The stars cut sharp above her, bright as flint. Their cold light reminded her of the eyes that had refused to meet hers. She thought of her mother, long buried, who had once hummed while weaving herbs into cord. She thought of her father, silent in his disappointment. She thought of the children who had once chased her in laughter, who now looked through her as if she were invisible. Her name, Tayan, once meant Song of Dawn. But alone in the desert, stumbling beneath the vast, indifferent sky, it felt like a name given to someone else. The cold came slowly, not in a sudden strike, but in a creeping way that crawled into her bones. She wrapped her arms around herself, whispering into the night, not prayers exactly, but fragments of words she had carried since childhood. She did not ask for life, not even for mercy. She only asked that her footsteps might leave some trace before the desert erased them too. When dawn broke, the horizon glowed red and gold. The light was cruel in its beauty. It showed her how small she was, how endless the dust stretched ahead. She stumbled often, knees tearing open against stone, palms raw and bleeding. She whispered, "Let me make it to water." She knew no one was listening, and yet she kept moving. When the riders came, she barely heard them at first. The thunder of hooves felt like a dream, like the earth itself had grown impatient with her. Two white ranch boys appeared through the heat shimmer, their eyes sharp with suspicion. She saw the way they looked at her, not as a woman, not even as a human being. To them, she was a problem, something to be dragged and handed off like a stray calf. She didn't resist. Her strength was gone, her spirit too. She thought perhaps they would end her quickly, and in some strange way that would be a kindness. But fate carried her somewhere else. They pulled her into the town of Cabin, a scattering of weathered buildings pressed against two canyon ridges. A town so small it seemed to survive only by stubbornness. She expected the rope. She expected the cage. That is what white men gave to women like her when they weren't taking worse, but instead they dragged her through the doors of the sheriff's office. And that's where she saw him. Silas Rohr, sheriff, war veteran, a man who looked as worn as the badge he carried. His limp was pronounced, his eyes shadowed by years of grief and silence. He didn't move at first, didn't rush to judgment, didn't spit or sneer like the boys who delivered her. He just looked at her, not with pity, not with desire, just steady, as though trying to decide whether she was still part of the living. When the boys let her go, Silas spoke. His voice was rough, quiet. Let her be. They grumbled, but they obeyed. He poured her water, set bread within reach, and stepped back. She waited for the demand, the bargain, the cruelty that always followed such gestures. It never came. That night she lay curled on a cot in the corner of his office, blanket pulled tight, the sheriff's silence filling the space. Outside, Cabin muttered its judgments. Inside, she breathed, barely believing it. Her exile had led her here, half dead, half broken, and yet not gone. Not yet? This was not belonging, not safety, not home. But it was something, a thread, a chance. And for the first time since her people had turned away, Tayan allowed herself the smallest thought. Perhaps this was not the end of her story, but the beginning of another. That is how it starts. A woman cast out, a sheriff who had given up building anything new, a silence between them that would become something more than either of them expected. If this story has already stirred something in you, I'd ask you to stay with it. There is more to come. More loss, more danger, but also resilience, and a quiet kind of love that isn't spoken so much as chosen. If you believe stories like this matter, please take a moment to like this video. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and follow the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Every voice that joins us here keeps these stories alive. The desert is a cruel place for a woman walking alone. By the time the two Wallace boys found her, Tayan's skin was burned raw, her lips cracked, her steps nothing more than the body's last argument with death. They didn't see her as human, just a problem. A shadow in deer hide, barefoot and bruised, staggering east like she didn't know which way the world turned anymore. The brothers didn't ask her name. They didn't ask if she had family or where she came from. They just hauled her across their saddles and dragged her into the town of Cabin. To them, she was less than a woman, just something dangerous if left out in the wild, something inconvenient if she died where others could find her. Cabin was a place that held on to its silence like a badge. Two canyon ridges pressed it in, a single street splitting its heart. The sun beat down on timber cracked from years without rain. Dust settled in every corner, as if it too had given up moving forward. The town wasn't, built for mercy. Strangers didn't last long here. And when the Wallace boys shoved Tayan through the door of the sheriff's office, no one expected anything different. Silas Rohr sat behind a scarred desk, his limp legs stretched out, his eyes heavy but sharp. He'd been sheriff here longer than he ever planned. 7 years past what he thought he could stand. Once a Union scout, once a husband, now just a man surviving each day with coffee strong enough to burn his throat. He didn't ask for much, and the town didn't give him much. That was how they got along. But when the boys brought Tayan in, something shifted. She didn't resist them. Her bare feet dragged across the floorboards, leaving faint streaks of blood where splinters caught her skin. Her head lolled, hair stuck to her bruised face. And still, her eyes were open, dark, steady, looking at nothing and everything all at once. Eyes of someone who had stopped expecting rescue. The Wallace boys smirked like they'd done the sheriff a favor. "Found her out by the southern ridge," one said. "No saddle, no weapon, no camp. Figured she's trouble. Best you handle it before someone else does." Silas didn't move. He didn't look at the boys. He looked at her, long enough that the silence stretched, long enough that the boys shifted uneasily. Then, slow as stone cracking under frost, Silas rose. Let her go. The older Wallace boy blinked, laughed nervously. "Sheriff, you sure?" "She ain't." "Now." The grip on her wrist dropped. Tayan swayed but didn't fall. She stood there barefoot, trembling, her face unreadable. The boys muttered something under their breath and left, boots loud against the planks. The door slammed. And then it was just her and Silas. For a moment, nothing moved. The dust hung in the air like it wanted to listen. Silas reached for the water barrel in the corner. He dipped a rag, filled a tin cup, and set them gently on the bench. He stepped back, his voice low. "Sit." She lowered herself slowly, as if waiting for the trick to reveal itself. She drank without lifting her eyes. She didn't touch the rag. Her hands shook. Silas went back to his desk, sat down, watched her over the rim of his coffee cup. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to, because in that silence, something lived. Not suspicion, not demand, just space. When the cot in the back was offered, she curled up without a sound, the blanket pulled to her chin. By the time he locked the door for the night, she was already asleep, back turned, breathing shallow but steady. Silas leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He didn't know why he let her stay. He didn't know what she carried or why she walked into the desert with nothing but her bruises. But there was something in her face, a resignation worse than fear, a calm that wasn't peace but surrender, and that stayed with him long after the lamp went out. By morning, the cot was empty. For one terrible second, Silas thought she'd vanished into the night, carried away like all the other things he'd lost. But then he heard it, faint scraping outside. She was crouched by the porch, her hands busy with his broken chair. She had stripped a broom handle, was sanding it against stone to make a brace. Her movements were slow, precise. She tied it with cord, tested it, sat down. The chair held. She didn't smile, but her shoulders eased, just a little. Silas said nothing, just went back inside, poured 2 cups of coffee, and set one on the porch rail. She glanced at it, at him, then took it in both hands. The taste made her grimace, but she drank anyway. And that was how it began, not with questions, not with confessions, not even with names. Just silence, shared like bread. A sheriff who thought his days of saving anyone were long gone, and a woman who thought she had already been given up to the desert. 2 souls, left half dead by the world, finding in each other not salvation, but the smallest reason to keep breathing. And that is where the story bends. A cast-out Apache woman dragged into a town that would never welcome her meets a sheriff who no longer believed he had anything left to give. What happens next isn't loud or grand. It's quiet, it's fragile, and it will change them both. If this story gripped you, don't let it go just yet. Please like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and follow the channel so you don't miss the rest. Because stories like this one, about survival, trust, and finding a place in a world that tried to erase you, are the kind that need to be told. At first, she stayed on the edges, not inside the sheriff's world, not fully outside it, but somewhere in between, like a shadow testing where it might fall. Tayan lingered on the porch, crouched by the broken boards, sweeping dust that would only blow back again by nightfall. She patched torn cloth left in the corner, set a shirt folded neatly by the chair. She worked without asking, moved without speaking, and Silas Rohr, the weary sheriff of Cabin, let her. He noticed every small thing, though he never said it. The chair that no longer leaned crooked. The floor swept clean when he came back from his rounds. The fire stoked higher than he'd left it. At first he thought she was simply restless, finding tasks to quiet her nerves. But after a few days, he understood. She wasn't just waiting. She was choosing to stay. For a woman cast out, staying was no small thing. Every step she had taken into the desert had been heavy with the belief that she wasn't wanted anywhere. And yet, when she reached this small town that gave her only stares and whispers, she did not run. She did not vanish into the hills. She stayed near the one man who hadn't demanded she explain herself. There was a morning when Silas stepped outside and found her bent over his busted chair, her fingers winding cord tight around a brace she had carved from an old broom handle. The fix was crude, but it held. She pressed her palm against the seat and nodded once, satisfied. Silas didn't thank her. He just carried out 2 tin cups, set one down by her side, and returned to his post on the porch. She lifted it, grimaced at the bitter taste, and drank anyway. In that quiet act, they found a rhythm neither had expected. The people of Cabin noticed. Of course they did. Nothing stayed secret in a town where the wind carried news faster than riders. They muttered in the saloon, shook their heads at the well. "Sheriff's got himself a squaw living in the jailhouse," one man sneered. "A curse, if you ask me," said another. But Silas didn't answer them, and neither did she. Their silence became its own defiance. Inside the cabin, Tayan began to leave traces of herself in ways even she didn't realize. A strip of fabric folded neatly on the shelf, herbs tied in bundles, drying above the stove. A patch sewn carefully into the sheriff's sleeve. At first, she moved with hesitation, waiting for him to scold, to push back. But he never did. Each time he let it stand, it was another thread woven into something larger than either of them admitted aloud. There were evenings when Silas sat at his desk with his badge glinting in the lamplight, and Tayan sat cross-legged by the fire, threading leather through her fingers. The silence between them was heavy, yes, but it was not empty. It was filled with the small sounds of life, crackling wood, the scrape of tin cups, the whisper of thread pulled through fabric. Slowly, without plan or promise, the silence shifted into something like comfort. One night she spoke her first word in English to him. Rain. She pointed to the clouds gathering low over the ridges, and her voice was soft, careful. Rain. Silas looked at her, nodded once, and said, "That's right." He didn't ask for more, didn't demand another sentence. That one word was enough. For both of them. And so the days passed. She worked, he watched, and their lives began to stitch together without either of them saying what it meant. He gave her space to breathe. She gave him a reason to notice the quiet again. For two people who had thought their lives ended years ago, him with the grave of his wife and child, her with the fire that burned her place in her tribe to ash. This strange rhythm was the beginning of something neither dared name. She did not belong to him. He did not claim her. And yet she stayed. That was the choice that mattered. Silence can be many things. It can cut, it can crush, it can make a person feel like they've vanished. That was the silence Tayan had known when her people turned their faces away from her. But the silence she found with Silas Roar, it was different. His quiet wasn't sharp or cruel. It didn't erase her. It left room. Room for her to breathe, to sit, to simply exist without having to prove why. She began to study him, not out of fear, but out of the need to understand the man whose roof she slept under. Silas moved like a man carved out of stone and scar tissue. His limp was steady, the rhythm of someone long used to pain. A bullet had lodged near his hip years before, and though it made his steps uneven, he never complained. He fixed what was broken around the cabin with the same patience he gave to his own wounds. Slow, deliberate, never rushed. He didn't ask for thanks. He didn't need it. Tayan watched his hands most of all. Large, calloused, scarred. The hands of a man who had held a rifle too long, who had dug graves, who had carried weight far heavier than tools or timber. Yet those same hands poured coffee with a steadiness that spoke of routine, even care. There was no tenderness in the way he set her cup down each morning, but there was something better: consistency. She began to see that as its own kind of kindness. At first, she waited for his silence to turn into questions. Where had she come from? Why was she cast out? Was she dangerous? But the questions never came. Silas never demanded her story. He let her offer only what she could carry, and in that choice, she began to trust him. His silence wasn't rejection, it was space. There were nights when he sat at his desk, the lamplight catching on the tin badge he still wore pinned to his vest. His eyes would wander to the door, not searching for her, not keeping guard, just lingering, as if he was remembering the woman and child he'd lost 10 years before. He never said their names. He didn't need to. Tayan could see the grief in the slope of his shoulders, in the way he sometimes leaned back and stared at the ceiling as though it carried the weight of memory. She recognized that grief. She carried her own version of it tucked deep into her chest. The loss of her people, the sting of being unwanted, the shame of being called barren. She thought she would be alone in that weight forever. But sitting across from Silas in the low glow of firelight, she realized They were two people carrying different scars in the same silence. The small things told her more about him than any story could. The way he kept the coffee kettle full even when the morning stretched long and dull. The way he checked the door locks twice each night, though Cabin wasn't the kind of town that needed watching. The way he never flinched when she moved near him, though most men tensed around her like she carried a curse. Slowly, she began to see that Silas's silence wasn't emptiness. It was steadiness. And steadiness was something she had never been given before. She began to mirror it, moving in her own rhythm beside him. In the mornings, she swept dust from the porch while he limped to the corral. In the evenings, she stitched tears in cloth while he cleaned the rifle laid across his lap. They spoke little, but their silence began to hum with life. For the first time since Exile, Tayan didn't feel like the world was waiting to push her out again. One night, the rain came, slow, steady, tapping against the roof. She pointed to the sky, testing her tongue around the English word. "Rain," she said softly. Silas glanced at her, nodded once, and answered. Rain? That was all. But it was enough. It was the first time she felt the quiet break, not with suspicion, not with judgment, but with recognition. In that moment, she understood something. Silence, when shared, is not empty. It is a shelter. And so, piece by piece, without vows or promises, without even speaking much at all, two broken lives began to fold into each other. Tayan started to trust that she was not just waiting here. She was staying. Cabin was a town that carried on in its stubborn silence. People lived side by side, but they did not often speak of what bound them together. They noticed everything, though, especially when someone didn't belong. And from the first day she walked into Silas Rohr's care, Tayan was marked in whispers. She was an Apache woman in a town that didn't trust difference. They looked at her with suspicion, sometimes with fear, and more than once with contempt. But everything changed the day the town doctor fell sick. It was Miller Haney, a ranch hand from Dry Creek, who burst into the sheriff's office near noon. His face was pale, his words tumbling over one another. "Sheriff, it's Doc Baker. He's bad off. Fever since last night, talking out of his head. His wife, she don't know what to do." Silas stood immediately, reaching for his coat, but before he could speak, Tayan was already moving. She grabbed the satchel she had been slowly filling for weeks. Herbs wrapped in cloth, roots dried in bundles, strips of bark, a small mortar, a bone needle. It was her mother's knowledge, passed to her without ceremony, tucked into memory and practice. She didn't wait for permission. She only looked at Silas, and in that glance, he understood. The three of them rode hard across the scrub. Dust trailed behind the wagon, the sound of the horses' hooves pounding against dry earth. Tayan sat in the back, her hands never still, separating mixtures, grinding leaves between her palms, sniffing dried stems as if each carried a language the others couldn't understand. Silas kept his eyes forward, but inside he felt a strange calm. She wasn't afraid. She was ready. At the Baker house, the air was heavy with heat and sickness. Doc Baker, a man stout and steady in his 50s, lay thrashing on the bed, his skin burning hot, his words breaking into nonsense. His wife sat in a chair beside him, tears streaking down her face, clutching a damp cloth that did nothing to cool him. The neighbors crowded the yard, murmuring, whispering, doubting. And then they saw her, the Apache woman. "She ain't no doctor," one man muttered under his breath. Another woman clutched her shawl tighter, suspicion plain in her eyes. But Tayan ignored them. She stepped inside, set her satchel on the table, and began to work. She asked for water with a gesture, and when it was brought, she dropped roots into the kettle, letting the steam rise. She crushed leaves into a paste and laid it gently across the man's chest. She burned herbs over the coals, filling the room with smoke meant to draw the sickness out. She brewed a bitter tea and coaxed it past his lips in small sips, steady and patient, even when his body resisted. She did all this without words, only with the quiet certainty of someone who had been taught by women who healed long before there was ever a town called Cabin. Hours passed. The whispers outside grew, thick with doubt. But Silas stayed inside the room, leaning against the wall, his eyes never leaving her. He knew the weight of courage when he saw it. By sunset, the fever began to break. Doc Baker's thrashing eased, his breathing steadied, his face slick with sweat but no longer burning red. His wife sank into tears again, but this time they were tears of relief. She whispered, "Thank you." But not to Tayan, not yet. She said it to Silas as if he had somehow called this miracle down. Silas shook his head and looked to Tayan. "She did it," he said simply. Tayan didn't wait for gratitude. She packed her satchel as the room filled with the sound of even breathing. She wiped the sweat from her own brow, her face calm but weary, and stepped outside into the gathering dusk. The crowd that had doubted her fell quiet. No one clapped, no one cheered. But something shifted. The suspicion in their eyes softened. The fear loosened. They didn't say it, but they knew. This woman had done what none of them could. The next day, no one apologized, but when Tayan walked to the well, the woman there passed her the bucket without a glare. The clerk at the store nodded once when she entered. The preacher's wife left a jar of honey on the sheriff's porch without a word. Cabin didn't speak its respect out loud. It never did, but it remembered what mattered. That night, Silas brought out a small gift of his own, a peach, rare in these parts. He set it on the table in front of her without explanation. She picked it up, turned it in her hands, and held it as if it were gold. She didn't eat it right away. She only let her fingers linger on the skin, and when her eyes lifted to Silas's, there was something in them he hadn't seen before. A quiet, steady trust. For Tayan, healing had always been survival. For the first time, it was also belonging. Names carry weight. They hold memory, history, and sometimes pain. For weeks, the sheriff and the Apache woman had lived in silence, their lives stitched together by work and the soft rhythm of shared space. But still, he didn't know her name, and she hadn't spoken it aloud since the night her people turned away. It hung inside her like a note trapped in the throat, waiting for someone to ask. It was late one evening when Silas Rohr finally did. The day had been long, dust rising in the streets, tempers running short, cattle stirring up noise on the edge of town. He had come back limping heavier than usual, his hip aching in the damp weather. The lamp burned low in the cabin, throwing long shadows across the walls. She sat on the floor, cross-legged, weaving thin strips of leather into cord. He watched her for a while, the quiet between them easy, but filled with something unsaid. At last he asked. His voice was steady, rough but gentle. "What's your name?" She looked up, startled at first, as though the question had pulled her from a place she had buried deep. Her hands didn't stop moving. For a long moment, she only met his gaze, the firelight flickering in her dark eyes. Then, soft but clear, she answered. "Tayan." The word lingered in the air, simple and powerful. It wasn't just an introduction. It was reclamation. Silas nodded once, repeating it, letting it rest on his tongue with care. "Tayan?" Something inside her loosened at the sound. For so long, her name had felt like an echo from a world that had erased her. Speaking it now, hearing it returned without scorn, felt like claiming herself again. Not the cast-out, not the burden, just Tayan. A woman alive in this moment, seen and heard. She lowered her eyes back to her weaving, but the tremor in her chest had nothing to do with fear. It was a kind of awakening. From that moment on, the walls of the sheriff's cabin felt different. Less like a shelter borrowed for survival, more like a place she might shape into her own. Silas didn't press for more. He didn't ask what the name meant or where she came from, or what drove her into the desert. He had no need for her story all at once. The name was enough, and that was his gift. He gave her the dignity to be known without being questioned, to be present without being defined by her wounds. In the days that followed, small changes began to bloom. She started leaving her work where he could see it instead of hiding it away. The cord neatly coiled, the herbs tied in bundles, the stitched cloth folded square on the table. She began humming while she worked, soft and low, fragments of melodies her mother once sang. And Silas, who hadn't heard music in his cabin in over a decade, found himself pausing just to listen. The town of Cabin still whispered, of course. The Wallace boys muttered about the sheriff's squaw. The saloon barkeep said she was trouble, but Silas never repeated their words to her. Instead, when he walked beside her through the street, he carried himself steady, his presence a quiet shield. Slowly the stares shifted. Not into friendship, not yet, but into something closer to respect. And for Tayan, each day she stayed was no longer just survival. It was choice. She chose to sweep the porch, not because it was expected, but because it felt like care. She chose to tend the small sage plant she placed by the window, its leaves reaching for the light. A mirror of her own slow reaching. She chose to speak her name again when Silas looked at her with his tired, scarred eyes. Tayan, she whispered once more, testing it on her lips in the privacy of night. And for the first time since her exile, the sound didn't feel hollow. It felt alive. Calder Boyd rode into Cabin the way a storm rolls over the plains, casual at the edges, dangerous at the center, and though no thunder sounded, every dog along the street went quiet, as if they could smell the change in the air. He came tall in the saddle, with a coat the color of dry earth and a pistol that looked like it remembered every name it had ever been given. And when he reined up in front of the sheriff's office, the dust lifted and hung there like the town was holding its breath. Folks on the saloon porch angled their chairs. A card game paused mid-hand, and somebody muttered that trouble had found its way back without needing an invitation, because that's how trouble prefers to travel. Tayan was inside, sorting the small bundles of herbs she'd strung to dry by the window, her fingers moving gently, her face still. That kind of steadiness you learn when you've had to pretend you're not afraid for longer than is fair. And when the door swung open, she didn't look up at first, but she felt the old chill lay its hand against the back of her neck, the one that says a memory just stepped into the room wearing boots. Boyd's eyes adjusted to the low light with the hungry tilt of a man searching for a prize he thinks is already his. And when he saw her, his mouth bent into the kind of smile that forgets the difference between a person and a thing. And he said her name wrong on purpose, stretching it like a rope, then added the claim he'd been saving, that she belonged to him, that he had business unfinished and papers somewhere to prove it if anyone cared to see. And there was a ripple along the doorframe, because words like that make the boards remember every time they've heard them before. Silas didn't rise fast. He never did. He moved the way rivers do when the current deepens, slow on the surface, dangerous underneath. And he stood between Boyd and Tayan with the quiet he carried like a second spine, a quiet that said he knew what fear could do to a person, but he also knew how to tell fear it could wait outside. This is the part where a lesser man talks loud to make himself bigger, where he slaps a badge and says, "Law like it's a spell." But Silas wasn't a spell kind of man. He was a choice kind, and he said only, "She ain't yours," which in that room meant more than a paragraph and less than a threat. And Boyd laughed, because men like him treat other people's lives like a joke until the punchline doesn't land. And he touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat and glanced past Silas to Tayan the way a trader glances at a mule, calculating, dismissing, already counting the coin. Outside, the street widened with eyes. Few boys climbed the rail. The clerk's wife pressed a hand over her mouth, and the preacher, who had never been much for sudden bravery, edged just far enough to say he'd seen this kind before. And it wasn't scripture that moved them. It was the math of fear. And the math of fear always looks to balance the ledger by taking something that can't be spared. Tayan did not step back. She did not speak, and she did not lower her gaze. She had done those things before, and they had only taught her how small a body can make itself without disappearing. So she stood with her hands quiet and her breath measured, and she watched Silas the way a sailor watches the horizon. Not because the ship will save you by being big, but because it will save you by being steady. The Wallace boys, who had once dragged her through that very door like a bundle of trouble tied with twine, stared at their boots because shame has a way of learning to read the room. And the barkeep leaned out and called to Boyd that Cabin wasn't buying what he was selling today, not with the sheriff between. And Boyd's smile thinned, his eyes narrowed, and he shifted in that slow way that every man with sense in his bones can hear, the way that says hands are about to move where they shouldn't. Silas didn't reach first. He only shifted his weight, pain flickering across his face like a shadow, the old bullet in his hip reminding him that the past keeps records. And in that heartbeat, Tayan remembered 2 winters earlier, the stink of sweat and smoke. Boyd pressing a hand to her arm with the kind of certainty she had spent her whole life refusing, remembered how nobody had stood then, how even the sky had felt far away, and she felt the echo rise in her throat. But this time the echo had a different answer, because this time the room didn't sway with his want. It steadied with Silas's refusal. "You can ride on," the sheriff said, voice low, almost kind, the way a man is kind to a rattler he's willing to let slip back into the grass. "Or you can find out how fast I still am when I don't aim to miss." And for a long second, the town measured the space between those words and Boyd's hand, a space as thin as the edge of a coin. Boyd let the moment hang, let it do the work men like him count on, the work of shrinking everyone else. But the room didn't shrink. Not Silas, not Tayan, not the light falling across the floorboards, like a line even a fool could read. And when Boyd finally said he'd be around, that the trail runs in circles and he has time to kill, he stepped backward, not out of fear, not yet, but out of the arithmetic of a day that hadn't tipped his way. He left his dust as a message. He always did, and the dust drifted for a while after he was gone, long enough for every person within earshot to decide who they were going to be the next time a man like that came knocking. Silas turned, the door clicked shut, and the room exhaled, and only then did Tayan feel her knees again, feel the small shake that comes when danger passes by, close enough to count your heartbeats. And she found the wall with one hand, the way a swimmer finds the edge of the pool, and rests there, not because she can't float, but because floating is something you can't trust after nearly drowning. Silas didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't tell her she was safe. He didn't say "you're welcome" or "I had to" or anything that would turn what he'd done into something she was supposed to repay. He just poured water, set it on the table, and said, "You hungry?" Making it not a question, but an invitation back to the ordinary. And she nodded, not because the hunger in her stomach mattered more than the shake in her bones, but because accepting a plate is sometimes the most courageous thing you can do after someone has tried to take your name. That night, the town talked itself into theories on the saloon porch. They always do. And the preacher's wife said maybe the Lord had sent the sheriff the kind of work you can't write in a ledger. And the Wallace boys sat very still and practiced the art of keeping their mouths shut. And the barkeep cleaned the same glass for too long, watching the street like he could polish it into safety. But the truth of the day wasn't in their talk. It was in what Tayan learned when the lamp burned low and the cabin settled. That a man had stood between her and a claim that wasn't a claim at all, and he hadn't done it because he wanted to own her in turn. He'd done it because some lines aren't about law or property or pride. They're about saying a life is not a thing to be fetched. And if you listen close, you can hear the lesson that lives in there, the one America keeps relearning in 100 small towns and kitchens and porches, that protection isn't possession, that kindness doesn't ask for change back, that the bravest sentence in any language is "I'll stand right here." And for Tayan, who had walked through exile and hunger and the empty echo of being no one's, it was the first time she believed it could be true for her. Not as a story told to someone else, but as a day she had survived because someone chose to be a wall without building a cage. Outside, the night took its time settling across the ridges. A coyote called somewhere past the creek, and inside the sheriff's cabin, two tired souls ate in the kind of quiet that knits itself into a promise. Not a promise of forever, not even of tomorrow, just the promise that when danger comes calling again, and it will, she will not face it alone. And that realization, gentle and astonishing, is how the shadow of Boyd began to lose its shape. The morning of the showdown began with a silence that felt heavier than most. Cabin's main street, usually buzzing with boots and voices, carried the kind of hush you only hear when everyone knows something is about to break. The sun was barely above the ridge, spilling long shadows across the dust when Calder Boyd stepped into the street. His coat swung open, his pistol rode low on his hip, polished and waiting. He wasn't a man in a hurry. Trouble never is. Silas Rohr pushed open the door of his office and limped out onto the porch. He didn't speak. He didn't call for order or raise his badge like a shield. He just walked down the steps and into the street, his rifle cradled in his hands. The limp was worse that day, but it didn't slow him. Every step was steady, deliberate. He was walking into a storm he'd already decided he wasn't running from. People began to line the boardwalks, pulled by the kind of tension you can't look away from. The barkeep wiped the same glass over and over, eyes locked on the men in the street. The Wallace boys, who once dragged Tayan into this very town like a burden, now stood tight-lipped, watching the sheriff take a stand no one else would. The preacher muttered a prayer, though even he seemed unsure who it was for. Boyd stood tall, smirk curling at the edge of his mouth. "One more chance, Sheriff," he called out, his voice carrying like a knife across the air. "Hand her over, and we walk away clean." Silas stopped 10 paces away, the dust rising around his boots. His voice was low, flat, but it cut clear. "No." The word hung there, simple and immovable. Boyd's smile thinned. He rested his hand lightly on his pistol, testing the weight of the moment. "You planning to die for her?" he asked. Silas's jaw tightened, but his eyes didn't waver. "She's not yours to take." The street went still. Even the horses tied to the rail seemed to hold their breath. For a long heartbeat, the world narrowed to two men staring at each other across a line of dust that no one else dared to cross. Then it broke. Boyd's hand moved. Silas's rifle cracked before most even realized the fight had started. The shot split the air, echoing off the canyon walls. Boyd staggered back, shock flashing across his face. His hand clutched his side, where blood was already blooming through his coat. He dropped to one knee, pistol slipping from his grasp into the dirt. The crowd gasped, a collective breath rushing out. But the moment wasn't over. Because when Boyd looked up, teeth bared in pain, he saw not just Silas standing steady with the rifle still leveled. He saw Tayan. She had stepped out of the sheriff's office, bow in hand, arrow notched and ready. Her arms were steady, her eyes fixed on him with the calm of someone who had already survived more than he could imagine. She stood beside Silas, not behind him, and in that stance was a truth Boyd couldn't ignore. They were together in this fight. The sight of her there, shoulder to shoulder with the sheriff, changed the math. Boyd might have taken a bullet and come back for revenge another day. But facing two people who refused to yield, one with a rifle, one with a bow, he read the message written in their eyes: silence. They were not going to give. Not now. Not ever. Blood dripping from his hand, Boyd spat into the dust. His smirk returned, but it was thinner now, hollow. "This ain't the end," he rasped, forcing himself back to his feet. "You can't hold what don't belong to you forever?" Silas lowered the rifle just enough to make clear the next shot wouldn't be a warning. "You'll leave cabin alive," he said, "but you won't come back." For a moment, Boyd's eyes flicked between them. Silas with his rifle, Tayan with her bow drawn and steady. He saw the refusal, the line he couldn't cross, not with bullets, not with threats. and with a bitter laugh, he turned. He stumbled to his horse, mounted with effort, and rode out. Dust swallowed him on the edge of town. The silence that followed was heavier than the one before. Folks along the boardwalk shifted, whispering, the kind of whispers that carry more respect than words of praise ever could. They had seen something that morning, something they didn't quite know how to name. Silas didn't look at them. He turned to Tayan. She lowered her bow, but her eyes stayed on him. For a moment, nothing passed between them but the quiet. But it was enough. She had stayed, and he had stood, and together they had faced down a man who believed fear was enough to claim a life. When they stepped back inside, the crowd slowly dispersed. Cabin went back to its routines, boots on the boards, hammers on nails, children calling from porches. But none of them forgot. Because that day, in the middle of a dusty street, they had seen more than a sheriff protecting a woman. They had seen two people draw a line together, and that, more than the bullet or the bow, was what defeated Calder Boyd. It didn't happen all at once. Towns like Cabin don't change overnight. But after the dust of the showdown settled, after Calder Boyd rode out bleeding and beaten, something subtle shifted. People who had only whispered before now started watching differently, not with the same suspicion, not with the same sharpness. The Apache woman who once drew stares like a curse now earned quiet nods. Respect doesn't always announce itself. It creeps in through small gestures, the kind only a careful eye can catch. At the well, a woman who once clutched her shawl tighter when Tayan passed handed her the bucket without looking away. At the mercantile, the clerk who had muttered about burdens gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod. The preacher's wife, without a word, left a jar of honey on the sheriff's porch one morning, the glass catching the early light. Cabin didn't say thank you with speeches, but in its own rough way, it remembered. It remembered who stood, who stayed, and who mattered when things broke. Inside the sheriff's cabin, the changes were quieter still, but they meant more. Tayan began planting herbs along the windowsill. Sage, yarrow, little shoots coaxed to life in the yash, stubborn dirt. Their scent filled the small space, earth and green softening the air heavy with coffee and gun oil. She hummed while she worked, low melodies that wove around the creak of the floorboards and the soft scrape of Silas's boots. It wasn't music meant for anyone to hear, but Silas heard it all the same, and he let it stay. Her presence lingered in small signs, an extra folded cloth left on the table, a carved stone placed carefully by the hearth, a braid of dried corn husk hung near the door. Silas never moved them, never asked her to tuck them away. He let her mark the place as hers, too. That was its own kind of permission, and maybe more than that. It was recognition. In the evenings, they settled into a rhythm that didn't need naming. Silas sat on the porch, rifle across his lap, his limp legs stretched long. Tayan brought her work outside, sometimes stitching, sometimes grinding herbs, always moving with the quiet patience of someone who had learned not to waste her hands. They didn't talk much, but their silence had grown into something different. It was no longer the silence of strangers waiting out the hours. It was the silence of people who understood each other without needing words. Cabin noticed. Of course it did. A Wallace nephew with a broken arm came to her quietly one afternoon, bypassing the doctor, who still looked pale from the fever she had broken weeks before. Tayan set the boy's arm in a splint using 2 straight sticks and a strip of cloth. Silas stood nearby, watching, saying nothing, but the boy's wide eyes lingered on both of them before he left. That evening, the Wallace patriarch gave Silas a single nod across the street. No words, just acknowledgement. And in a town like Cabin, that was more than most ever got. For Silas, it was the little things he noticed most. The way Tayan began to leave her hair loose in the evenings, not bound tight in the braids of watchfulness. The way she hummed softly at dawn, hands busy sweeping dust from the porch before the town stirred. the way her hand sometimes lingered on the doorframe as she walked inside, as if touching it was proof she was allowed to cross. He had lived years in rooms too empty to hold echoes. Now every corner carried some trace of her. And for Tayan, belonging was not a grand arrival, not a ceremony of acceptance. It was the slow recognition that her steps no longer felt temporary, that the cot in the corner had become her bed, that the sage by the window had begun to root strong, that she could breathe here without feeling the weight of being unwanted. She had not been given a home. She had made one. The end didn't come with a gunfight or a burial. It came with a piece of paper, a letter from the county, stamped and signed, telling Silas Rohr that his time as sheriff was finished. Someone younger, someone more fit, would take the badge and the desk and the ledger. That was how the world turned, slowly forgetting the men who held it up when no one else would. Silas read it twice, folded it once, and set it on the table. He didn't curse, he didn't argue. He just sat there, his hand resting on the badge he'd carried longer than he ever thought he would. It had kept him busy, given him something to hold when grief threatened to break him. But now, looking at Tayan moving quietly in the cabin, her hands tying herbs, her voice humming low, he realized maybe it was time. Time to lay it down. 3 days later, the new sheriff came. Young, clean, starched like an ironed shirt. He brought his books and his questions and his confidence. Silas handed over the keys, left the badge on the desk, and walked out without looking back. He had given Cabin what he could. Now he was free to choose something else. And so they settled near the ridge. The cabin they found was sun-warped, leaning a little to one side, but the bones were good. Silas patched the roof while Tayan stacked stones for a fire circle. She planted sage along the fence line, hung bundles of herbs from the rafters. The air began to smell of cedar and smoke, of work that belonged to them both. There were no vows, no ceremonies, no grand words to mark the beginning. Just two people, scarred and worn, choosing each other every day in the small ways that mattered. He split wood, she boiled water. She sang softly while grinding roots. He leaned back on the porch and let the sound remind him what living felt like. The town came sometimes. A woman with a cough, a ranch hand with a broken finger, a child with a fever. They came to Tayan for healing, and they nodded to Silas out of respect. Nobody said the word friend, but they came, and they trusted, and that was enough. For Silas, the silence inside the cabin no longer pressed on him like a tomb. It carried warmth, the scrape of her chair, the hum of her songs, the soft weight of her presence, turned the quiet into something worth keeping. And for Tayan, the small space that once felt borrowed became a home she had shaped with her own hands. She was no longer cast out. She was no longer invisible. She was here. The truth of their life was simple, but simplicity has its own kind of grace. They weren't bound by law or tribe, by paper or ritual. They were bound by choice. A sheriff who had lost too much, and a woman the world had tried to erase, building something that belonged only to them. And maybe that's the heart of it, the lesson their story leaves behind. That sometimes survival isn't about outrunning the past or proving yourself to a world determined to misunderstand you. Sometimes it's about staying still long enough to choose what matters and who matters. Tayan chose not to walk back into the desert. Silas chose not to let grief be the only company he kept. Together, they chose a life. Not a perfect one, not a safe one, but theirs. When the first frost came, Silas sat on the porch with the old harmonica in his hands. He hadn't played it in years. He lifted it to his lips, drew a note out thin and unsteady. Tayan stepped out, wrapped in a blanket, and sat beside him. "Play it again," she said softly. So he did. And for the first time in a long time, he remembered what it felt like to breathe without waiting for the world to take it away. That's how it ends. Not with a badge, not with a gun, but with two people choosing to stay. She is no longer cast out. He is no longer alone. And together, They've built something that doesn't need a name to be real. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of the quiet strength that comes from choosing each other in a world that takes too much, then I'd ask you to stay with us. Please like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and follow the channel so more stories like this can live. Because the West wasn't built only on gunfights and dust, it was built on small homes, hard choices, and the simple, extraordinary act of staying.